I wanted to begin our roundtable today with a land acknowledgement before we go any further. I wanted to acknowledge that we at the CIL work on the territory of Ytuarte, the ancestral and unceded lands of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, who have been the stewards of this land for generations and continue to be so. I wanted to express my gratitude and honor towards Ohlone communities and commit to deepening my solidarity, our organization's solidarity with their liberation struggles. Some notes on access. Also, as you can see, we have our ASL interpreters present today, and we also have a live transcript feature that can be turned on in your sound settings. I encourage everyone to exist in this space however they need to during this roundtable. So turning your camera on and off, getting up, stretching, doing whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. Just a note, in order to keep this event as accessible as possible for everyone else, to please keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question. We have our wonderful advocacy program manager, Helena, here today running tech and also being on the lookout for accessibility requests or tech issues in the chat. So feel free to put those in the chat or raise your hand if that's most accessible to you. All right. And then last bit of housekeeping, just wanting to give everyone a roadmap for our conversation today. I want to say first, I'm so thrilled to have such a big group joining us tonight. I'm really excited for our evening. We have had so many questions, like dozens of questions submitted prior to this roundtable, and we've chosen a few to guide our discussion today. And then we'll save the last 10 or 15 minutes for like a live Q&A. So the folks who are here today who maybe have additional questions that were brought up by something you heard or something else that's come to mind, there will be the last 10 or 15 minutes or so for a live Q&A. And with that, I will turn it to our wonderful panelists to give some brief introductions of themselves, and then we'll go into some of our first questions on the subjects of tenants' rights. Do any of our presenters feel excited to jump in and start?
So do you want introductions right now?
Yes, yeah, great.
Okay, I'll start with the introductions, if that's okay. Hello, everybody. Paola Laverde here. I'm going to copy what Emma said. So I am sitting next to a window. I am wearing a gray sweater with a black shirt, and you'll see a bike and a table behind me. I have ADHD, confirmed. So that can be an issue sometimes. I am a representative for the Berkeley Tenants Union here in Berkeley. I'm also a rent board commissioner for the city of Berkeley. I have been one since 2014, and my term ends in November. Thank you. I'm very thrilled to be here and to be able to provide some information that will hopefully be helpful to some of our participants today. Thank you.
I could go next. This is Eddie. I could go next if you like. So I am Eddie Ytuarte, and I work with the Oakland Tenants Union. And I am really, really pleased that CIL and Emma and Helena are doing this. I've been involved in tenant rights work with the Oakland Tenants Union some 20 years, and this is the first time a disability-related organization has come to us and asked us to participate with them and others in doing what we're doing today, and that pleases me at no end. I've been a little bit disappointed with disability groups in the state as a whole. Just to mention, we've had a couple of attempts at overturning the Costa-Hawkins law that it's not good for tenants in the state, and only about one or two organizations in the last time it went on the ballot one or two disability organizations responded to that and endorsed that effort to get rid of that law. And I hope this is the start of a new era, and CIL is one of the leaders in this. And I am Oakland Tenants Union. We know quite a bit about local laws, the Oakland laws. I don't know about that much about Berkeley, but we have Paola here, and I know a little bit about the state laws. So we're not going to get to all the great questions that are out there, but I just want to make sure that the Oakland Tenants Union, especially if you're involved in Oakland, living in Oakland, you have our name. It's easy to get a hold of. Call us back for if anything comes up or some questions today are not answered.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Flanery. I am a staff attorney and clinical supervisor at East Bay Community Law Center. I am a white woman with brown hair and black rimmed glasses. I have a bookcase behind me. I have been with EBCLC for about a year now. We are a nonprofit legal services organization, and I work specifically with our housing unit. My focus is primarily on eviction defense work, but I do some general tenants' rights issues as well. I mostly focus on Berkeley and Oakland, but have some experience with South County as well. And I was previously on the Oakland Rent Board in the same capacity that Paola is in Berkeley, but my term just ended. So I am happy to be here with everyone, and I look forward to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much, Hannah. I didn't know that about the Oakland Rent Board. That's a really cool thing to learn about you. So to kick us off to open our conversation today, we had a few different questions from audience members just wanting to know a little bit more generally about just some important rights that they should know as tenants, and if you all had any specific information about tenants' rights that might be particularly useful for disabled tenants to know about, or any special rights or protections that disabled tenants might have. Yeah, and whoever wants to unmute and jump in, I feel like we can be informal like that rather than raising hands. Great, well, Paola.
If you allow me to jump in, the city of Berkeley has some very strong tenant protections. Fortunately, we're very fortunate. Even if you don't live in rent-controlled housing, and we do have protections. And the protections that I really want to focus on is the Tenant Protection Ordinance. And this ordinance was passed in Berkeley in 2017. And I can say that this ordinance is something that the Eviction Defense Center is really using. And so far, since 2017, the Eviction Defense Center has filed 12 lawsuits or 12 claims under this ordinance. And so far it's received five settlements. And the settlements have been in the thousands of dollars. One senior received $85,000. Another person, and these are long-term tenants in Berkeley. The issue in Berkeley right now is that if you're a long-term tenant, and especially if you're in rent-controlled housing, there are a lot of people experiencing harassment from their landlords. But if these five settlements so far, there is actually one case where the rental housing provider, I always call them the business owners, actually was trying to harass a mother with her disabled child. So what does this ordinance say? This ordinance says it prohibits conduct that may coerce a tenant to vacate a rental unit involuntarily. And I'm going to list off some of the things that the landlords must not do in bad faith. And if they engage in any of these following conducts, they use lies, threats, or use of violence to induce a tenant to move, threats regarding immigration status, disruption of service to the rental unit, interference with the right of privacy, including inquiries about immigration status, abuse of the right of access to the rental unit, exploitation of disabilities or other traits of the tenant, which is what is germane to our conversation today, failure to perform and complete repairs in a timely and professional manner, threats not to perform repairs and maintenance, failure to accept or acknowledge receipt of a tenant's rent or to promptly deposit the rent or to refuse to provide a receipt, violations of the tenant buyout ordinance, which, you know, a landlord has to offer money to a tenant if they're going to move in under one of the buyout ordinances. Like, let's say the landlord decides that they want to bring in one of their family members, they're supposed to provide up to $15,000, or if the tenant is 60 years or older, up to $20,000, and it's actually a little bit more than that. I think it's up to $21,000. And then engages any of the tenants in any form of human trafficking as a condition that the tenants continue occupancy of the rental unit. So this is really important for tenants to know that they have this protection. If a tenant is requesting that the landlord provide some repairs, habitable repairs, and they refuse to do it, the tenant should consider, reaching out to EDC, the Eviction Defense Center, to see if they can file a claim against the landlord. And they're doing it successfully. But it's good for them to be aware, for tenants to be aware of this particular right in Berkeley. Thank you.
This is Eddie in Oakland. Two of the things that tenants really have to be aware of that Oakland has is that there is rent regulation for many units, for units built before 1983. Because of the Costa-Hawkins law, the way it's worded, we cannot change that unless it's that law. Well, actually, that law got turned around a little bit in the last couple of years. But nonetheless, in Oakland, it's 1983, the way our law is. The other thing that's really important for people to know is evictions, because landlords threaten people with all ways of evicting. Landlords just bring up the subject, and tenants, unfortunately, are ready to move out just because the landlord raises the issue. The other couple of other things that tenants in Oakland should know about, all tenants, would be the moratoriums. There's still a county one, and we have one still in Oakland. They're pretty good. People are not going to get evicted unless they're a threat to others, and perhaps Ellis Act. So there are protections right now. For people with disabilities, there are state and the ADA, the Federal Americans with Disability Act, and a state act giving protection to tenants. And basically, two of the main issues that come up when people call up the Tenants Union is that the landlord will not allow a service animal to be on. So we advise people, well, so that's easy, really, in terms legally. That's easy on what to recommend to tenants that have disabilities. The other thing is some confusion about accommodations. So I do try to, because I take just about all of these questions, and I do try to tell people about the accommodations, or else I will often refer them to the legal groups, especially the disability legal groups. But those four of the things that our viewers here today might want to be aware of, especially if they're in Oakland.
I don't have much to add. I think you guys covered it really well. The list I made ahead of time covered what you guys said. If I had to give my spiel, it's you have the right not to be harassed. The TPO in Berkeley is incredible. Oakland also has a very strong TPO. They're very similar. Those are the tenant protection ordinances. And you have that protection at the state level too, but locally there's really an emphasis on the city's understanding that landlords will go through extrajudicial means to try to get tenants out. Harassment is a huge way of trying to do that. And so those ordinances are really important. You have the right not to be harassed. You have the right to a habitable home, like Paola talked about. I mean, that means you have the right to have repairs done and to have them done timely and correctly. Rent control and just cause are huge. I don't know if we want to talk about evictions separately or not, but A very significant thing to know right now is what Eddie said, which is that the eviction moratorium in Alameda County is still in effect. And so unless there is an exception that applies to your tenancy, you can't be evicted right now in Alameda County. And I think in terms of rent control and just cause, it's just important to understand that if you're a long-term tenant, your rent and you're in a rent controlled unit, by this point, your rent can only go up by a certain amount and your landlord can't evict you without just cause. And I used to work specifically with seniors and adults with disabilities in San Francisco. And in my experience, long-term rent controlled tenancies are for folks living on fixed incomes, somebody receiving retirement benefits or disability benefits. The ability to stay housed in our communities often turns a lot on whether or not you are in a rent controlled unit, if not a subsidized unit. And so those are huge. And I just can't underscore enough how much I hope that I want tenants to know that those rights exist if you're in one of those units. And then the last thing that I would say is reasonable accommodation rights, but I think that we'll talk more about those later, it sounds like, Emma.
Yeah, wonderful. Paola, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to add that, retaliation is a real fear, but retaliation is against the law. And so I just would everyge tenants that they have rights, they can exercise their rights. And everything that tenants do, every communication they have with their landlord should be in writing. Either you text them or you email them, and to make sure you save everything. Because if you experience retaliation, in a way to be able to prove your cases, and if you're being harassed, all those, keep notes. If your landlord calls you and starts saying something to you, harassing you and, threatening you, make sure that after you deal with that experience, you sit down and write it out. And then, text your landlord back and confirm, hey, this is what you said to me. These are all really, really important tactics, because if you're experiencing this, and I know it's stressful, but if you bring your claim to EBCLC, you have something to prove your case, and that's really helpful. Because the landlords right now, they're a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them, they are in the rental housing business for one reason: to make money. And if they can get rid of a long-term tenant, they will do everything they can. So it's important for tenants to know that they do have rights and they are protected, and that they, have ways to protect themselves. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for that amazing intro. And some things that I think all of you touched on a little bit was the issue about unreasonable accommodations. And we actually had a few questions submitted by audience members beforehand around the subject of reasonable accommodations. And so I combined a couple of those questions, and I'll just read them out and see if we can speak to reasonable accommodations for a little bit. So one audience member asked, if a tenant's mobility decreases in the time that they're in a unit, is the landlord required to make a reasonable accommodation? And then another tenant or another audience member asked a related question of, how do you go about getting accommodation requests for a tenant after they've been approved for subsidized housing, was this person's question specifically. So wanting to think about reasonable accommodations when you're in a unit already, and maybe also if there's anything different when it comes to subsidized housing.
I can talk a bit. There are reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications, and sort of the law governing those is slightly different. I know less about reasonable modifications because reasonable accommodations come up much more frequently in the context of eviction defense. But to your question about the mobility question, that would fall very likely if what we're talking about is some sort of alteration that needs to happen to the unit to keep you in your home. You do have the right to request certain alterations. There's a lot of nuance, and it's hard to give like a straight answer on what that looks like, but And some things, this question of like reasonable, right? What does that mean? That's often the question, but you should always, it never hurts to start that conversation, right? And I've seen plenty of cases where we were able to successfully get tenants something like a chairlift installed on the steps going up to their unit. That would be one example. I saw this question ahead of time, and I was talking with the social worker at our organization, because the question of like how much of the cost falls on whom is kind of complicated, but there are organizations out there that will also help to fund certain modifications. And actually, I asked her who, and the first link she sent me was for CIL. So I don't know, Emma, you might be able to speak to that better than I can. But that's what I'd say about reasonable modifications. Other, things that I've seen done, obviously something like a grab bar in the shower. I've seen kitchen counters lowered, different things like that. Those are all things you're entitled to make the request, have a conversation with your landlord, and depending on like whether or not it's feasible, to what extent it can be done to get those things done. As for reasonable accommodations, more broadly, I think something I would underscore is just that they can be a very, very, very powerful tool. And you can look at a lot of different things as being couched as reasonable accommodation requests. Like Eddie gave the example of support animals, and I think that's like the textbook example that we think of, but they can, reasonable accommodation requests can come in they can look a lot of different ways. And similarly, what does the reasonable piece mean? That can be a complicated analysis, but one thing I want to emphasize is that if you make a reasonable accommodation request to your landlord, and you don't have to use those terms, but it makes it easier if you use the buzzword, they have an obligation to have a conversation with you. If you send your landlord a request for a reasonable accommodation and they ignore you, that's a violation of the law. And so it really helps to start a conversation with your landlord. And if ultimately, you can go back and forth on what's reasonable, what's not. Ideally, you'd have a bit of familiarity kind of with what the rights are. And there are accessible resources out there for that process, but that's what I'd say about that. I want to flag just two things. If your landlord is ignoring you, if nothing's getting done, places like EDC, affirmative attorneys, sometimes take these cases on as lawsuits because it is disability discrimination. It is grounds to sue your landlord. There are sort of more user-friendly processes. Specifically, there's what's called a DFEH complaint, the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. And there are also HUD complaints. So HUD is at the federal level. So the person who asked the question about subsidized housing specifically, if you have just a private landlord, a DFEH complaint might make sense. If you're in federally subsidized housing, you can actually reach out to HUD. And both of those entities have a complaint process. And it's an online form that you fill out. It's not very long, not very complicated. You fill out that form, kind of explain what's going on, and you can also call, I think, or submit something by mail. But and then an investigator or somebody from one of those agencies should call and reach out to you and start the conversation of, possibly opening up an investigation. It's been a mixed bag for me in terms of success with those investigations. And I'll say it's, not the greatest system I've ever seen, but it's in terms of the accessibility for people and for tenants who are able to do it without assistance from attorneys compared to something like an actual lawsuit. It can be a powerful tool. So that's kind of the overview that I'll give.
This is Eddie. Thanks, Hannah, especially when you mentioned that it's kind of a mixed bag as to whether the complaints are successful or not, because that's something I wonder about. We get complaints about the housing authority in Oakland. Not a whole lot, but we also get complaints in Oakland about the nonprofits. And so I think what's needed, incidental to what our talk is about, I think what we need especially if coming from the disability community, is some ways to organize people that are in the nonprofits and that live in housing authorities, or even Section 8, those kind. There is a national organization. I just researched them right now, and unfortunately, there's not even a California chapter. So there's a really bad need for organizing these groups. Here's the thing about disability, folks. So I have a physical disability. It's permanent, but a lot of activists that I work with are younger, and they're, at some point they're going to be moving on as homeowners, and they're not going to be tenants anymore. So us as people with disabilities are in a particular niche where we have these permanent disabilities, and a lot of us are either Section 8 or in nonprofit housing developments, but there's no specific organizing that's going on with that. And I would like to, that's been my dream to do that. I don't know how to do it. I'm just one person, but I hope CIL and other disability organizations start taking a serious look at organizing us people with disabilities that are in nonprofit housing or Section 8.
I would like to add, and thank you, Eddie. I was canvassing recently, and this has come to light. And as I'm getting older, I did come across someone who's been in their unit for almost 30 years. They were healthy and young when they started. Now they have issues. They've developed Parkinson's disease, and it's going forward. And this person said to me, and they live on a second floor, and they said, I would like to be on a first floor. They live in a rent-controlled unit, and actually I counted the steps because I went and visited them this week. They have 40 steps they have to go up, and eventually they will become immobile. And so they need to start thinking now, what are the next steps for them? Because they've lived in their unit. They live in an affordable unit, 2-bedroom unit, that costs $1,400 in North Berkeley. Imagine that. It's very affordable. So I agree with Eddie that, people in the disability community, but also elders who were, who now are experiencing or beginning to experience the effects of old age. Your body starts falling apart. We need, and I want to be able to reach out to these folks and bring awareness that they, about their rights and what they can do, what rights they can do, what rights they do have, and how they can move forward to make sure that the rights and their situation are being protected.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you all so much. There was another question that was submitted by an audience member that was kind of piqued in my mind after hearing Eddie talk a little bit about like the housing authorities, and then also nonprofit housing developers and nonprofit like housing buildings or situations. Sorry. And we had a audience member who submitted this question about having difficulty and facing barriers to access, even in the application process for some of these housing units through some nonprofit housing developers like Saha and Eden Housing, and also having a similar kind of inaccessibility in terms of the application and process to places like the Oakland Housing Authority and Alameda County Housing Authority. So folks with disabilities running into inaccessibility and barriers even before like they're able to become a tenant. So like not even able to exercise their tenant's rights, like having a hard time even getting into a place because of lack of accessibility features in these application processes, and they being pretty complex and pretty repetitive. And I don't know if this is something that any of the three of you could speak to, but it was a question that was really alive for one of our audience members.
I would like to follow up. This is Eddie. So I've been getting serious complaints about one of the organizations you mentioned And over the years, I've gotten complaints from other from other tenants that live in nonprofits. And by the way, not all much of nonprofit housing is not affordable. They call it affordable, but it's not. If if you're under 30% of your area medium income, it's not affordable to those folks a lot of times. So in a sense, that's a little bit of a incorrect thing to say. But there is an organization called East Bay Housing Organizations, which serves the nonprofit community very well. I think there's about 50 or so nonprofits in the East Bay, and I like these guys because they do EBHO, because they do a lot of progressive things. They've joined us in movements in Oakland to do really change laws. I mean, these guys are really good. And they do have community organizers, but the community organizers organize the tenants to do something on behalf of the nonprofits. Like, they're great at putting out people to go to city council meetings and have a lot of residents from non-community, from nonprofits talk about the need for more money for nonprofit housing, but they're not organizing the tenants that also need help when they're having trouble with their management of their company and of their nonprofits. And so I would like to see EBHO use some of their resources to be organized on behalf of people that are having issues with nonprofits.
Wonderful. Thank you, Eddie.
I don't know that I have really anything specific to add, but I feel very similarly to what Eddie said. And this often, I deal with a lot of the affordable housing providers in the context of they're trying to evict my tenants. So you can imagine, it's sort of a fraught relationship. So I think that it often feels like the accountability that's needed in that space. It does feel like it's something that could benefit from more organizing. And I'm somewhat familiar with EBHO, like Eddie said, and it does seem like they're kind of starting to. They seem like a good place to start in terms of somebody who might potentially be having that conversation. In terms of like applications and going through that process, I don't have anything useful to offer other than just validation that it's not a good system. And I was practicing in San Francisco before, and it felt like there were a lot more resources to support tenants and specifically folks with disabilities trying to navigate the application process. And I do think that's something that I hope the East Bay will start to have more of, because the process it can be a nightmare. And I do hope that that conversation is at least happening in the spaces in terms of funding providers and the nonprofit circles, in terms of how I can't tell you how many calls we get, and, can you just help me look for housing, which isn't something that we do. And I just really hope that we'll move in that direction, because it isn't a good system.
And I see a hand from an audience member, Sheila. Sheila, if this is an additional question, do you mind if we save it for our live Q&A in about 10 minutes, or is it related to what we were just speaking about?
I'd like to follow up on the question that just occurred.
Okay.
I've been dealing with EBHO on this matter, and on one hand, they seem receptive. I spoke with Gloria Bruce, and I've spoken with Megan, and I don't know her last name off the top of my head, about the Oakland housing ordinance. But the problem is that every application is now online, and that is a good thing if the online platform is accessible. However, it's not. And even after you are a tenant in OHA, and I experienced this in HACA as well, you can ask for a reasonable accommodation. You can do all the forms. You can set up all the processes, and they don't do it. And I will, Eddie, do a HUD complaint, I suppose. I have no faith in them either. I am pursuing some legal avenues because this has been a problem that I have been aware of for at least since 2015, but I was working housing in 98 to 2000, and it was a problem then too. And so yeah, we need more enforcement, and we need clarity from HUD to the housing authorities that this stuff needs to be done, and it needs to be in an equitable and accessible manner, and it's not being done that way now.
Yeah, I just want to add that, thank you, Sheila. You know, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And I would encourage you to make your complaint. Yes, it's not accessible. I work in a state agency, and it is, you know, staff has to learn how to create accessible documents. They have to do these things. Sometimes it's not a priority, although the law requires it. The only way that they will pay attention if you start complaining a lot more. And unfortunately, the federal government is so huge and HUD is so huge. I don't know if you've considered trying to write an email to the Congresswoman. I don't know if who your Congresswoman is, if it's Barbara Lee or not. But start with those issues and writing letters to them and start complaining to them about this issue. It may help. It may help, but at least it's bringing attention to them that HUD is not being responsive, and the local agencies are not being responsive to what is needed in our communities. You know, we have the baby boomer generation is a generation that is aging right now, and we have a huge wave. It was huge. It's a huge wave that is aging right now. I was born in 1964. I am the last end, and I'm at 58. And so there are a lot of people just ahead of me who are aging, and so these issues are important to us as this generation. So I would encourage you to file your complaint, to file your lawsuit, to call the congressperson, to call your assembly member, to let them know this is a problem. And maybe that will move the wheel forward. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. We're coming up just right about the time for our live Q&A. So folks who are here attending tonight we can address some questions that you all might have on your minds right away. But I wanted to just ask one more final question that was submitted to us prior to the roundtable today. And it was a question about someone who's living in a senior building. And they said that I'm a tenant in a senior building. And some of the other seniors in my building are afraid to speak with building management and afraid that they'll be kicked out. And I wonder if we could speak a little bit with our panelists in terms of maybe some reassurances or some more information or options that this person in their senior building might have. And I think it relates also to kind of another question that we had submitted just in terms of what are some tips to get involved in tenant organizing, and like, how does one do it? I know that those are some big questions. And so maybe we'll just take a few minutes and then we'll go into our live Q&A.
May I start? So I just want to share that landlords, people are afraid for many reasons. And landlords depend on the fear of tenants. And because tenants are afraid, landlords will not do anything. They thrive on that fear. So as soon as tenants stop being fearful, that's when our voices can start being heard. And there are protections. There are places you can go to, EBCLC, EDC, and and to make your voices be heard. If tenants are afraid, then the landlords are winning. So fear is what holds a lot of people back. So stop being fearful. That's what I would say. Stop being afraid, because there are protections. Berkeley has protections. Oakland has protections. There are state protections. And so be aware of your protections and know that retaliation is illegal. And it's hard. I mean, it's hard. I can just say that easily. I'm not living in a situation where I'm fearful, but fear is a great limiter on how people can exercise their rights.
This is Eddie. One of the things in situations like this, we constantly advise people to do is talk to other tenants and see if, and work together with other tenants, even maybe for seniors, it might be really hard. I don't know, but we advise people to try to consider forming tenant associations in their building. And there have been some that are formed. There's even an organization in the area that specifically does that work. We don't do it at the Tenants Union, but we will do, we'll do Zoom things with groups of tenants if they come to us. But so that's one of the things that we really emphasize is work with other tenants as a way to deal with nasty managers or landlords. Now, the nonprofits, they're supposed to have councils of tenants to do social things, and I would hope that they would do, if issues come up that are bothersome, excuse the phone in the background. But it seems like these councils are not working or not functioning, especially during COVID. But that's one solution that's one alternative we often talk about at the Tenants Union is people working with each other.
I very much defer to the organizers on this one, but I thought what Paola said at the beginning hit the nail on the head in terms of putting things in writing, and if you're having conversations in person, following up and memorializing, here's what we just talked about. And it can feel like uncomfortable and awkward. So it's just kind of something that you have to get used to doing, because if, as a lawyer, one of my mottos is, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. Write it down. If you make a complaint, if you call your landlord, make a complaint, shoot them a text afterwards. If you're in the kind of place where there's like a front desk person, you stop by and talk to the front desk person, put it in writing, take a picture of it. You don't have to have like a fancy copy, just take a picture of whatever you hand to them. You can keep a little log if you're having interpersonal issues with them. If you're starting to think like, hey, this stuff's kind of starting to happen, and I think maybe it's retaliatory, keep a little log, build your case. Because that, it's this thing, it's like retaliation's illegal, but like, does that mean your landlord isn't going to retaliate against you? What you have to be preparing for is to defend yourself, or potentially, having a case, an affirmative case brought, but just documenting as much as you can.
Thank you all so much. Okay, well, we have about 12 minutes left in our roundtable this evening, and so I thought we would start the live Q&A portion of our evening. We had a couple of questions in the chat from Anna, and then also Anna, I see your hand raised. Would you like to unmute and ask your questions live? I can also read them from the chat if you'd like to do.
I just wanted to comment on some of the great suggestions people have been giving, but they're not real useful in terms of helping. I've been through all of them. And it's not that they're not useful. That's the wrong term. What it is that there's no one backing us up once we do these things. And so I have written, I have complained, I have talked to my city council person, I've shown the evidence, I keep the written record. I have done all of these things, and the people at the city in Oakland are not that helpful. And I've gone to tenants organizations, and because mine was not a, they had to triage because of the pandemic. And so I am not even though I'm being threatened all the time, but not physically or mentally threatened, but just constant adding money to my ongoing thing, saying I haven't paid. There's all kinds of harassment going on. I'm a senior, I'm disabled, and it's very hard for me to cope. I'm actually at the edge right now where I'm feeling that I can't deal with this anymore. So, and I don't know what to do. So, but when I did go to one of the legal firms, they had a student who'd go back and forth between the attorney. It got extremely frustrating because the information got distorted, each time. And then I had to do more work after each time that it was well-intentioned, it was just problematic. And so anyway, that's all my comment is that there's nobody backing us up. So when things do go wrong, it's scary. It's very scary. And I've been as active as I can, but now I'm losing my abilities to be more active. So these other questions I put in the chat, I don't have to say, you can just look at them. They're simpler questions. They're just information, but I don't know if there's any solution for backup for us right now. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it. We need it.
Yeah, Anna, thank you so much for sharing your comment and your experience. And I believe you and cannot imagine how frustrating and harrowing it has been, and to feel like the systems that are set up to support just don't always work the way that they say they do or they should. And so just wanting you to know that I believe you. And Anna, we can also, if you want to reach out to the CIL, we can also try to connect you and I or someone else at the CIL and see if we can talk through a little bit more and try to get maybe some support from an advocate in terms of finding out what you've done and seeing if there's any place we can go next if you're just wanting some support from someone. So I would encourage you to reach out to the CIL also if you have capacity. Paola, did you want to speak to this?
Yeah, Anna, I'm reading your question in the chat and says that they're saying that you can't get the signature anymore as proof that as a receipt that you deposited your rent check.
Well, what I've been doing because previously they said I didn't pay. So the last 2 years since the pandemic, I go downstairs and have them sign each check, and I have the bank write out the check and then I have them sign it. So the past 2 years, even though I've had that, they still say months I didn't pay. And now this time is the first time that they wouldn't sign it.
Do you still have to put it in the Dropbox?
Yeah, not before. I didn't have to put it in the Dropbox when it got signed because I kept the receipt.
So my suggestion is when you're going to put it in the Dropbox, you have your check, you take a picture of the,
I did.
Yeah. So that's one way of showing proof that you've done it.
Yes,
maybe, I don't know, put the date on the envelope.
No,
that's great. I mean, yeah. Okay. Great to hear that you're being proactive like that, but that's the only thing that I can think of coming to mind to have to deal with that type of harassment. And Hannah, maybe you can advise if that's okay.
No, that's right. You seem to be very good at documenting. Yeah, I was going to say something similar, and it's I think that ultimately, if they're trying to, it's clear that something's going on there, right? And they're trying to yes, I don't know exactly what they're trying to do, but and all I can say is it does sound like you're doing everything you can. And I also want to validate that I know it can be hard to find support for things like this when there aren't the clear safety nets in place. And I am one of those attorneys who often has to say, we triage and we have to prioritize evictions, and it doesn't feel good. And my hope is that, and Paola spoke to East Eviction Defense Center. My hope is that more funding will come so that more agencies can sort of step into these roles of taking on, sort of being able to be more proactive instead of just having to be with tenants who are constantly on the defensive. Just, it's like the bare minimum is just keep the person housed is often where we are. And it's so frustrating. And I'm sorry that you're going through that.
Well, that's why when we say be fearless and stand up and do those things, I'm not sure that's good advice right now. If people can't get backup. It might be more dangerous.
Well, it sounds like you're doing everything you can in terms of, preparing yourself. And I do want to applaud you for that.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, I don't see any other live questions in the chat, but I would invite anyone who is present today and has some follow-up questions from anything we've talked about or anything else that's on your mind. We have about 5 minutes, so maybe we could do another live question or maybe even 2. Feel free to throw it in the chat, raise your hand or unmute, whatever is most accessible for you. Oops.
Sheila Stack.
Great.
Hello, my name is Rosie Tellez. I am in Los Angeles. I work for a nonprofit organization. So we provide, I'm with Disability Rights California. I'm one of the employees there under the Peer Self-Advocacy Program. So oftentimes, I don't work with the legal team, but we work with my fellow peers who experience and is living with mental health disabilities. One of the things we find that despite of the fact that individuals are transitioning into the community from either a state hospital or a locked facility, oftentimes they may have family that may provide support. At times, if they're under conservatorship, they process to the point where they may not have a conservatorship. It will not be considered gravely disabled. If they are under SSI or SSDI, they may go into programs where then they obtain employment. I'm kind of walking you through an individual's life here, very similar to my own, and the experiences are somewhat similar. Suppose they want to go into, employment and have been stable in employment for some time, but then they find some discrimination upon when they're ready to obtain what is this called? Fair lending. It's more like when they find that they're being discriminated against, the fact that they're a person with a disability, they're obtaining SSI or SSDI, they may be benefiting from CalAble account and family support to obtain possible loan to get a house that would possibly be more accessible that they have not been able to find in the community. Maybe a duplex, a condominium, anything of that sort, but they're finding discrimination upon application of, the loan. So any ideas to what can a person like myself or my fellow peers get support from?
I was going to say, and our panelists can jump in if you do have some thoughts, but in terms of with focusing on tenants' rights and then thinking about purchasing a home, I just don't know if in my research and preparing for this presentation, and then maybe the folks from the unions might not have a lot of background knowledge on that point. And I don't know in terms of like the discrimination with like the loan piece, if there's anything that you would know, but this might be like just a little bit outside of maybe what we had prepared for tonight, but also maybe
no
not.
worries. I appreciate that. I really appreciate all your wonderful information today. I'm really glad to hear from other organizations I have not had an opportunity to hear from before, and some of the scenarios some of my fellow folks out here in the community are dealing with. So I may just want to put it in your ear, maybe plug for an opportunity to consider putting a workshop together for those of us who are looking to, purchase. So thank you.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'll note that down. Thank you so much, Rosie.
If I can say something, this is Eddie. So I mean, there's really nothing that I can really offer. The only question is if Rosie feels this is actual discrimination on a person with disability, and if so, I think I would investigate that either through DRC, Disabled Rights California, or some other legal group. I would want to find out if that constitutes actual discrimination and go from there.
All right, everyone, we are just at 7 o'clock, so the end of our roundtable discussion. I know there were several, let's see, live questions that we didn't get answered, and then several questions have been submitted to us prior that we weren't able to cover today. And so I think that's just signaling to us that there's a lot more that we want to know and a lot of information to be shared. And so not sure what it'll look like in the future, but hopefully we can continue this conversation and this won't be just a one-off event. I wanted to thank everyone so much for coming. Eddie, Paola, Hannah, if you had any final closing comments before we let folks back to their evening.
Thanks. Thank you. Briefly, again, if folks have any questions, especially if you're in Oakland, about your rights, what the laws are, Oakland Tenants Union, you could get to us by mail, or best thing is phone.
Thank you, Eddie. Also, if you're in Berkeley, we hold monthly legal clinics. So if people are interested, berkeleytenantsunion.org, or berkeleytenants@gmail.com. They can write us an email and to see if you get on the list, so that if you need to talk to a tenant provider, there's only 5 slots. We do give priority to members of the Berkeley Tenants Union, but if you're interested, you can join the organization. Thank you. Thank you very much for having us here. This was really good. I really appreciate it. And unfortunately, housing is such a valuable commodity, and I really feel like the laws are heavily swayed on the business owner. And so tenants, we do need to organize and have our voices heard, because we're not, like I said, the scales are for the business owners and not the tenants. But thank you.
Thank you all. Emma, thank you for organizing. This has been really great. I'll say my one plug I'll make while I have a room full of people is, I saw a question from Emma about Ellis Act cases that we weren't able to talk about today, but I just wanted, because my wheelhouse is eviction defense and we're talking specifically about tenants with disabilities, I'll plug that if anybody ever gets, and there are fault evictions and no fault evictions, and if you're in Oakland or Berkeley and you're ever served with an Ellis Act eviction or an owner move-in eviction, there are rights specific to seniors, people with disabilities, low-income people, depending on the jurisdiction, other groups, but you have to respond to the notice to trigger those rights. So I just wanted to flag that if you get an eviction notice, read the paperwork. In theory, it's easy. I think Berkeley has a postcard that you can send back, Paola, you might know, but there are significant protections for those types of evictions. Usually the notice period is 120 days, but if you trigger the protections, it's a year. So that's just a tiny thing. I hope it doesn't apply to any of you. I hope none of you are getting one of those notices. But if you do, it's just such a significant and easy thing to do that I wanted to put it on your radars.
Yes, if people get an eviction or an Ellis eviction, they can reach out to the rent board. And the rent board's phone number is 510-981-RENT. Let me repeat that, 510-981-RENT. And you can talk to a housing counselor and they can provide you, where to go. They can give you some advice.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. I wish we had just more and more hours. There's so much wonderful information here, and I appreciate everyone that joined us this evening. Thank you to all of our wonderful panelists. Thank you to our ASL interpreters. Thank you so much. And Helena for running tech. I really appreciate everyone. I'll be sending a follow-up email to our Zoom registrants with some information. Make sure you have all the phone numbers, websites, information that you might need from this roundtable. And then other than that, I can be reached with questions at ciladvocacy@thecil.org. It was also in your registering info. So reach out to me if you have any other questions, and thank you everyone so much. Take good care. Bye.